My name is Frank Miller, and this happened to me back in 1963 when I was working as a ranger at Glacier National Park in Montana. I still get chills thinking about it, even after all these years. Sometimes when I look down at my missing feet, replaced now with prosthetics, I wonder if anyone will ever believe my story. But every word of it is true. I was 45 back then, living alone in the Northern Ranger Station. My wife Sarah had passed away 2 years before from cancer, and the only thing I had left of her was this old silver compass she'd given me on our first anniversary. "So you'll always find your way home," she'd said. I kept it with me all the time, my lucky charm, I guess you could say. The locals knew me as the guy who survived being trapped in an avalanche for 6 days. That experience, plus my time as an Arctic warfare specialist in the military, made me pretty good at handling the brutal winters up here. But nothing, not my military training, not my survival skills, not even that avalanche, could have prepared me for what happened that January. It started with the cold. Not your regular winter cold, but the kind that burns your lungs when you breathe and freezes your eyelashes together. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, something I hadn't seen in all my years at the park. The snow was coming down so heavy you couldn't see more than a few feet in front of you, and the wind howled like a wounded animal. I remember sitting in my station that first night, listening to the storm outside. The radio was crackling with static, and I was trying to get in touch with the other stations. We had reports of 3 hikers who'd gone missing the day before. Stupid to be out in weather like this, but people don't always listen to warnings. Little did I know that those missing hikers were just the beginning. Little did I know that the thing that took them wasn't the cold or the storm, but something that had been sleeping in these glaciers for thousands of years, something that was finally awake and hungry, something we would come to call the Pale Walker. If I close my eyes, I can still see it, 9 feet tall, its body like crystal ice you could almost see through. The way it could make spears appear out of nowhere, pulling the moisture right out of the air. The way its touch could freeze a person solid in seconds, leaving them like statues, with looks of pure terror on their faces. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you exactly how it all happened, every terrifying detail. And maybe then you'll understand why, even now, I never go out in the snow without Sarah's compass close to my heart. The morning after that terrible cold hit, I got a call from Pete, one of our newer rangers at the South Station. His voice was shaking. "Frank, you need to come see this. We found the missing hikers." I bundled up in my warmest gear and took the snowmobile out. The whole way there, something felt off. The air was too still, like nature itself was holding its breath. Even the birds were quiet. And in all my years as a ranger, I'd never heard these woods so silent. When I got to where Pete was waiting, I knew right away something was wrong. The hikers were there all right, but not like anything I'd ever seen before. They were frozen solid, standing upright in a perfect circle, like they'd been caught in mid-step. Their faces, I'll never forget their faces. Pure terror, every one of them. Their eyes were wide open, their mouths frozen in silent screams. "This isn't normal, Frank," Pete whispered, his breath making little clouds in the air. "Look at the ice around them." He was right. The ice wasn't natural. It grew in strange spirals around their feet, climbing up their legs like crystal vines. And it was clear, clearer than any ice I'd ever seen. You could see right through it, like glass. But the strangest thing? There weren't any footprints around them, none at all. In fresh snow there should have been tracks, but it was like they'd just appeared there. While we were examining the scene, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The ice, It was growing, right there in front of us. Tiny crystals spreading across the snow, making a soft, crackling sound like breaking glass. "Pete," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "get your camera. Document everything. Then we're getting out of here." As Pete went to get his camera from the snowmobile, I pulled out Sarah's compass. It had never failed me before, but now the needle was spinning wildly, like it couldn't find north. I tapped it, shook it, but nothing helped. That's when I heard it, a sound I can only describe as ice scraping against ice, coming from somewhere in the whiteout around us. And for just a second, I saw something move in the swirling snow. Something tall. Something that shouldn't have been there. "Pete," I yelled, "we need to go. Now." We made it back to our vehicles, but that was just the beginning. The real horror was still to come, and it was heading straight for our ranger station. That night, the temperature dropped even lower. The radio started picking up strange noises, not static, but something that sounded almost like whispers. And the blizzard that blew in wasn't like any storm I'd ever seen. It was like the snow was alive, searching for a way in. I didn't know it then, but we were about to be trapped with something that had been waiting in these mountains since before humans walked the earth. Something that was about to show us why the native people never ventured into certain parts of these glaciers during the dead of winter. The storm hit harder than anything I'd seen before. Pete and I made it back to the northern station, where Tom, our radio operator, was trying to call for help. None of us knew we'd just walked into a trap. "The radio's acting weird," Tom said, fiddling with the dials. "I can get through to someone, but all I hear is this strange sound." He turned up the volume. What we heard wasn't static, it was like ice cracking, mixed with what sounded like whispers. My compass was still spinning in circles. That's when the lights started flickering. The wind outside got so loud it felt like a freight train was passing by. The windows frosted over in seconds, but not normal frost. It made patterns I'd never seen before, like someone was drawing with ice. "Look," Pete pointed at the window. Through the strange frost patterns, we saw it. A tall figure, standing in the swirling snow. It was like looking at a person made of glass, but it moved. Its head turned toward us, and even though it didn't have a face, we could feel it watching. Tom rushed to the door to make sure it was locked. That was his mistake. The door burst open with a blast of snow, and the thing, the pale walker, was suddenly there, right in the doorway. It was so tall it had to bend down to get in. The cold that came with it was worse than anything I'd ever felt. Not normal cold, but the kind that burns. "Run!" I shouted. But Tom was frozen in place. The creature reached out with one long, icy hand and touched his shoulder. I'll never forget what happened next. Ice spread across Tom's body like water soaking through paper. In seconds, he was completely frozen, his face locked in a look of horror. Pete and I ran deeper into the station. We could hear it following us, that sound of ice scraping against ice. The lights kept flickering, and in the darkness between flashes, we could see its shadow getting closer. We made it to the storage room, but Pete tripped. I turned to help him up, and that's when we saw the ice crystals starting to grow around his feet. They spread fast, climbing up his legs like vines. "Frank," he screamed. "Help me!" I tried to pull him free, but the ice was too strong. It grew faster and faster, making crackling sounds as it spread. Pete's eyes were wide with terror as the ice reached his chest. "Take this," he gasped, handing me his notebook. "The cave, the paintings. You have to." Those were his last words before the ice covered him completely. Now there were 2 ice statues in the station, and I was alone with the thing that had made them. I backed away from Pete's frozen body, clutching Sarah's compass in one hand and Pete's notebook in the other. The temperature kept dropping, and I could hear the pale walker getting closer. But something Pete said stuck in my mind. What cave? What paintings? I had to find out, but first, I needed to survive the night. And the creature wasn't going to make that easy. I was trapped in the storage room, listening to that thing move through the station. Every now and then I'd hear that awful ice-scraping sound getting closer, then farther away, like it was searching for me. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely open Pete's notebook. But when I did, what I found inside changed everything. Pete had been doing research on local Native American stories about the park. There were rough sketches of cave paintings he'd found in a hidden cave near the old geothermal vents. The drawings showed something that looked just like our ice creature, tall, thin, made of ice. But more importantly, they showed how to fight it. I knew I had to get to that cave, but first, I had to get past the monster. I waited until I heard the sounds move to the far end of the station. Then, as quietly as I could, I put on every piece of warm clothing I could find in the storage room. The whole time I kept thinking about Tom and Pete, frozen like statues just rooms away. Getting out was like playing the world's deadliest game of hide and seek. Every step I took might give me away. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart stop. The cold was so bad now that my breath froze in the air the moment it left my mouth. Finally, I made it to the back door. But just as I reached for the handle, I heard it behind me, that horrible scraping sound. I turned around slowly, and there it was, filling the hallway with its massive ice body. Up close, I could see right through it, like it was made of the clearest glass you've ever seen. Where its face should have been, there was just smooth, curved ice. It raised one long arm, ice crystals forming at its fingertips, ready to freeze me like the others. I did the only thing I could think of. I threw a kerosene lamp at it. The lamp shattered, and the creature let out a sound like cracking ice. It didn't hurt it much, but it gave me just enough time to burst through the door into the blizzard outside. The snow was blinding, but I had Pete's map in his notebook. The cave was about a mile away, near the old geothermal vents, where steam still rose from the ground. The whole way there, I could feel it following me. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of it in the swirling snow, a tall, ice-clear shape moving way too fast for something so big. When I finally found the cave entrance, I was nearly frozen solid myself, but what I saw inside the cave made me forget about the cold. The walls were covered with ancient paintings, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the dim light, and they told a story, the story of the Pale Walker. The paintings showed it sleeping in the glacier for thousands of years, only waking up during the coldest winters. They showed it taking people, freezing them, keeping them like trophies in its ice. But most importantly, they showed how the ancient people had fought it. The creature was born from the deepest cold, and only the Earth's heat could destroy it. The geothermal vents, that's why this cave was here. The ancient people had used the hot steam to drive it back into its ice sleep. That's when I heard it again, that scraping sound at the cave entrance. I wasn't trapped in the station anymore, but I was trapped in this cave, and the Pale Walker was coming for me. But now I knew how to fight it. I just had to figure out how to use the steam vents before it turned me into another frozen statue. I backed deeper into the cave, feeling the warmth of the steam vents behind me. The Pale Walker ducked its massive ice body through the entrance, blocking the only way out. In the dim light of my flashlight, it looked even more terrifying, like a giant ice sculpture come to life. My feet were already going numb from the cold it brought with it. Ice crystals started forming on the cave walls. Even the steam from the vents began to freeze in the air. I knew I had only one chance to get this right. I reached into my pocket and squeezed Sarah's compass for luck. To my surprise, the needle wasn't spinning anymore. It was pointing straight at one of the larger steam vents behind me. Maybe Sarah was still looking out for me, even now. The creature moved faster than anything that big should be able to move. It reached for me with those long ice fingers, and I dove to the side just as they scraped the cave wall where I'd been standing. The wall instantly froze over, ice spreading like a spider web. I rolled behind a large rock near one of the steam vents, and that's when I noticed something. The creature kept its distance from the steam. Every time a burst of hot air came up, it would back away slightly. The ancient paintings were right. Heat was its weakness. But the pale walker was smart. It started forming ice spears from the air and throwing them at me. One grazed my arm, and I could feel the flesh freeze instantly. I lost all feeling in that part of my arm. I had to act fast. I pulled out my emergency flare, the last one I had. The creature threw another ice spear, and this time it hit my leg. The cold was so intense I screamed. Ice started creeping up from the wound. With my leg frozen to the ground and the ice spreading, I had only seconds left. The pale walker moved in for the kill, reaching out to freeze me completely like it had done to Tom and Pete. That's when I lit the flare and threw it, not at the creature, but at the largest steam vent behind it. The flare hit the rocks and exploded, cracking them open. A massive burst of hot steam shot out, hitting the pale walker directly. The sound it made was like 1,000 windows breaking all at once. The steam hit its ice body, and cracks started appearing all over it. It tried to move away, but I grabbed my ice axe with my good arm and smashed the rocks around the other steam vents, releasing more jets of hot air. The creature was caught in a crossfire of steam. Its ice body started melting and cracking. It reached for me one last time, and our eyes met, or at least, I felt like they did, even though it had no real eyes. In that moment, I saw something ancient and cold and patient, something that had existed long before humans, and would probably exist long after we're gone. Then, with a sound like an avalanche, it shattered into thousands of pieces. The pieces themselves shattered into smaller pieces, until there was nothing left but a fine powder that looked like snow. The temperature in the cave immediately began to rise. The ice that had spread over everything started to melt, but the ice on my leg and arm remained. By the time help arrived 3 days later, drawn by the smoke from my signal fire, the doctors couldn't save my feet. The frostbite was too severe. They found Tom and Pete's bodies in the station, thawed out but long gone. The official report blamed everything on the storm and the extreme cold. Nobody believed my story about the ice creature, and eventually I stopped telling it. But every winter, when the temperature drops below zero and the snow starts falling, I take out Sarah's compass and watch it carefully. So far, the needle hasn't spun again. But I know the pale walker is still out there, sleeping in some ancient glacier, waiting for another cold winter to wake it up. And sometimes when the wind howls just right, I hear that sound, that scraping of ice against ice, and I remember that there are things in this world older and colder than we can imagine, things that sleep in the deep ice, waiting to wake up again. My name is Maria Vasquez, and this happened to me back in 1975, when I was working as a forest ranger in Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina. Even now, after all these years, my hands shake when I think about those dark October nights in the forest. but I need to tell this story. People need to know what's out there. I was 38 then, and I just transferred to Pisgah after what happened at my last post. I'd spent 15 years doing search and rescue in the Rocky Mountains, until that terrible night when I lost my whole team. I was the only one who made it back. The official report said it was an avalanche, but I knew better. I knew what I saw that night, even though nobody believed me. Pisgah was supposed to be my fresh start, a quiet post in the ancient forests of North Carolina, far from the snow and ice that still haunted my dreams. The locals told me the forest was special, sacred to the Cherokee people who lived here long ago. I should have listened more carefully to their warnings. I remember my first week like it was yesterday. The forest was beautiful in October, with red and gold leaves floating down through the morning fog. But there was something else too, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up whenever I walked my patrol route. Sometimes I'd stop and listen, sure I'd heard footsteps behind me, only to find nothing but swirling mist when I turned around. Then the missing persons reports started coming in. At first it was just one, a hiker who wandered off the main trail. That happens sometimes, and usually they find their way back, but he didn't. Then another person vanished, and another, always during the new moon, when the nights were darkest. I knew something was wrong when I found the first campsite. The tent was torn to shreds, like something had ripped through it from all sides at once. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no footprints leading away. Just scraps of fabric floating in the morning breeze, and an awful silence where there should have been birdsong. That's when I started noticing the totems, old wooden carvings hidden among the trees. They looked ancient, weathered by countless seasons. Each one showed the same warning: dark shapes with glowing eyes, hunting in packs through the shadows. The local Cherokee elders wouldn't talk about them directly. They'd just shake their heads and say, "Some things should stay buried in the old stories, Ranger Vasquez. Some things shouldn't be awakened." I wish I'd understood then what they were trying to tell me. Maybe I could have stopped what happened next. Maybe those 3 college kids would still be alive. But I was too focused on doing my job, on proving to myself and everyone else that I could handle this post, that I wasn't broken by what happened in the Rockies. I didn't know then that the shadows in Pisgah Forest were hungry, and they had already caught my scent. It started with the howls. I was doing my night patrol when I first heard them. They weren't like normal wolf howls. These seemed to come from everywhere at once, like the whole forest was crying out. I'd shine my flashlight into the trees, but the beam would just get swallowed up by the thick fog. The Forest Service helicopter came to help search for the missing campers. I remember standing in a clearing, watching its searchlight sweep back and forth through the trees. Then the pilot's voice crackled over my radio, scared and confused. "Something's wrong," he said. There's something up here with us. It's impossible, we're at 500 feet. The searchlight spun wildly, and I heard metal screech. Then the radio went dead. The helicopter's lights flickered once, twice, and went dark. I watched helplessly as it spiraled down into the forest. By the time I got to the crash site, there was nothing left but twisted metal and empty seats. No bodies, no blood. Just long, dark scratches in the metal, like giant claws had torn through it. That night, I saw them for the first time. I was heading back to my truck when my flashlight caught something moving between the trees. At first, I thought it was just shadows from the branches, but shadows don't have eyes. Glowing yellow eyes, floating in the darkness, and shadows don't move against the wind. They were shaped like wolves, but wrong. Their edges weren't solid. They seemed to drift and flow like smoke. I counted 6 pairs of eyes, all fixed on me. They moved without making a sound, spreading out in a circle around me. They were hunting me, just like they'd hunted the others. I ran. What else could I do? I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, branches whipping at my face, my boots slipping on wet leaves. I could feel them behind me, getting closer. The air got colder wherever they passed, like they were sucking the warmth right out of the night. I made it to my truck, jumped in, and slammed the door. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I turned it, my headlights lit up the trees in front of me, and there they were, 6 black shapes standing right in front of my truck. But when I blinked, they were gone, melting away like they'd never been there at all. That's when I knew the stories were true. The things the Cherokee elders had warned about, the ancient evil in these woods, it was all real. And now it was hunting again. But the worst part? The part that still gives me nightmares? As I drove away that night, I looked in my rearview mirror. In the red glow of my taillights, I saw more eyes opening in the darkness. Dozens of them, and they were all following me. They were learning, watching, planning, and I was the only one who knew they were there. I couldn't sleep after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing yellow ones staring back at me. I knew I had to do something, but how do you fight shadows? The answer came from an unexpected place. I was checking the old camping sites again, hoping to find any clues about the missing people. That's when I met Sarah Two Rivers, an elderly Cherokee woman who lived at the edge of the forest. She was placing small bundles of herbs near the trees. "You've seen them, haven't they?" she asked me. She didn't even look up, just kept working with her herbs. The shadow hounds, the ancient ones, spoke of them. They hunt in the dark of the new moon, when the night belongs to them. My hands were trembling as I helped her with the herbs. How? How do I stop them? Sarah touched a worn stone pendant around her neck. "They are creatures of darkness, Ranger. They fear what brings light. Our ancestors built sacred circles in caves deep in the forest, places where they performed rituals to keep the shadows away. The brightest light will blind them, but it comes with a price." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah said. Then something clicked in my mind. I remembered the emergency flares in my truck. They contained phosphorus that burned with an intense ultraviolet light. Could it really be that simple? I got my chance to test my theory sooner than I expected. The next evening, while checking the northern trail, I heard the howls again. This time, instead of running, I took out a flare. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped it. The shadows came sliding between the trees, just like before. 6, then 10, then more, their yellow eyes gleaming. They moved closer, forming a circle around me. I could feel their hunger, their cold. One of them growled, and it sounded like rocks grinding together deep underground. I struck the flare. The bright UV light exploded in the darkness. The shadow hounds screamed, a sound I'll never forget, like metal being torn apart. Where the light touched them, their shadowy bodies seemed to burn away like paper in a fire. They tried to retreat, to melt back into the darkness, but the flare's light was too strong. For a moment, I thought I had them beat. But then I saw more eyes opening in the darkness beyond the flare's light. Many more. And I had only brought 3 flares with me. I ran again, but this time I had a plan. I'd seen an old cave entrance earlier that day, with strange markings around it, markings like the ones Sarah had described. If she was right about the flares, maybe she was right about the sacred circles too. The shadow hounds followed me, just like I hoped they would. But as I ran deeper into the forest toward the cave, I couldn't help wondering, was I really hunting them now, or were they still hunting me? Either way, I knew the real fight was about to begin, and this time, only one of us would walk away. I ran into the cave with my last 2 flares clutched tight in my hands. My flashlight beam bounced off the wet walls as I went deeper and deeper underground. Behind me, I could hear them coming, their weird growls echoing through the tunnels, bouncing around until it sounded like they were everywhere at once. The cave twisted and turned, but I kept going. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might burst. Then I saw it, exactly what Sarah had told me about. The tunnel opened into a big round cave room. On the walls were paintings that seemed to glow faintly, circles and symbols in some kind of shiny red paint. This was it, the sacred circle the Cherokee had used to fight these things. I didn't have much time. I could feel the cold getting stronger as the shadow hounds got closer. My flashlight beam caught movements in the darkness. They were trying to surround me again, just like in the forest. But down here, they couldn't escape so easily. I pulled out both flares and waited until I saw the yellow eyes. They were everywhere now, dozens of them, maybe more, floating in the darkness at the edge of my flashlight beam. The shadow hounds were moving slower than usual, like they were being careful. Maybe they could sense the power of this place, too. One of them stepped forward. It was bigger than the others, its shadow body darker somehow. A leader? It looked right at me, and made a sound that was almost like words, a deep, scratching whisper that made my skin crawl. Now or never, I whispered to myself. I struck both flares at once. The UV light exploded through the cave, bouncing off the walls and the shiny symbols. The light got brighter and brighter as it reflected, until it was like being inside the sun. The shadow hounds screamed and tried to run, but the light was everywhere. There was nowhere for them to hide. I saw their bodies breaking apart like smoke in a strong wind. But the light, it was too much. It felt like my eyes were on fire. I tried to close them, but I could still see the brightness burning right through my eyelids. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like forever. I just stood there, holding the flares up until they finally died out. When the light faded, the cave was empty. No glowing eyes, no cold feeling, no shadows moving where they shouldn't. The shadow hounds were gone. But so was my sight. The doctors said the intense UV light had permanently damaged my eyes. I can still see a little, shapes and shadows, some colors on really bright days. But mostly, my world is dark now. Sometimes people ask if it was worth it. They try to comfort me, saying I was brave but foolish. But they don't understand. Those things were hunting people. They would have kept killing, kept spreading. Someone had to stop them. I still live near Pisgah Forest. Sometimes, on dark nights when the moon is new, I sit on my porch and listen. The normal sounds of the forest have come back. Owls hooting, wind in the trees, animals moving in the underbrush. Normal shadows have returned to the forest. But every now and then, I think I hear something different. A far-off howl that doesn't sound quite right. And even though I can't see much anymore, I always keep a box of emergency flares by my door, just in case. My name is Thomas Mitchell, and this happened to me back in 1988, when I was working as a ranger at Lake Tahoe. I still remember it like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. I was 52 then, living alone in the ranger station on the north shore of the lake. It wasn't much, just a small cabin with a radio setup and some basic equipment, but it was home. Before becoming a ranger, I spent 15 years as a Navy diver. and I thought those days of being scared of what lurks underwater were behind me. I was wrong. You see, 3 years before all this happened, I lost my son Jimmy in a diving accident. He was only 17, and it was supposed to be a routine training dive. I still wear his diving watch, one of those fancy digital ones he saved up for months to buy. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear its soft beeping, reminding me of him. That summer started like any other. Tourists came with their boats and jet skis. Families had picnics on the beach, and I did my usual patrols. But something felt different about the lake. The water seemed darker somehow, and on quiet nights, when I looked out from my cabin window, I could swear I saw strange lights dancing deep below the surface. I didn't think much of it at first. When you work alone at a lake this big, your mind can play tricks on you. But then the reports started coming in. A couple of fishing boats had gone missing, and when we found them, they had these weird marks on their hulls, long, deep scratches that no rock could make. The other rangers joked about it being the work of the Lake Tahoe monster, but I knew better. I'd seen enough strange things in my Navy days to know when something wasn't right. The water level was rising too, even though we hadn't had much rain. And the fish, they were acting weird, swimming in tight circles near the surface, like they were trying to get away from something down below. One morning, I was checking the depth readings near Thunder Cove when my equipment started going crazy. The numbers kept jumping around, showing impossible depths, and then I saw it, a flash of blue-green light, like nothing I'd ever seen before. It reminded me of those deep-sea creatures that make their own light, but this was different. This light seemed alive. It moved with purpose, and for a split second, I felt it calling to me, just like the deep water had called to Jimmy on that terrible day. I knew right then that something was very wrong at Lake Tahoe. Something that had been sleeping for a long time was waking up, and it was hungry. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning of the scariest summer of my life, and that the lake I thought I knew was hiding secrets darker than any of us could imagine. The other rangers at the stage, Mike and Sarah, they thought I was getting paranoid. Tom, they'd say, "You've been spending too much time alone up here." Maybe they were right, but every time I looked at Jimmy's watch, I got this feeling in my gut. The same feeling I had the day I lost him. And if there's one thing I learned in the Navy, it's that you never ignore your gut. It all started getting worse one quiet Tuesday morning. I was doing my usual check of the marina when Bob, one of our regular fishermen, came running up to me. His hands were shaking as he held out his phone to show me some pictures. "Look at this, Tom," he said, his voice trembling. "Found my boat like this at dawn." The photos showed deep scratches on the bottom of his boat. Not random scrapes like you'd get from rocks, but 3 long lines, perfectly straight, like giant fingers had grabbed it. What scared me most was that these marks looked fresh, and they went deep into the metal. That same week, more strange things started happening. The water at the north end of the lake, usually crystal clear, turned murky green. At night, people kept reporting weird lights under the surface, not like boat lights or reflections, but something that moved in ways that didn't make sense. I remember one evening particularly well. I was sitting on my dock, holding Jimmy's watch like I always did when I needed to think. The lake was unusually still, like glass. Then I saw it, a soft blue glow moving under the water, making patterns I'd never seen before. It was beautiful, in a scary sort of way, and for a moment I couldn't look away. My head started feeling fuzzy, like when you stand up too fast, and I almost fell forward into the water. That's when Jimmy's watch started beeping, snapping me out of it. The next day, I started digging through old records in the station. I found reports from the 1940s about similar things happening. Boats going missing, strange lights, the water level rising for no reason. But the weird part was, it all stopped suddenly after a few months, like whatever caused it just disappeared. Sarah, our newest ranger, helped me look through more recent files. "Tom," she said, pointing at some old newspaper clippings, "look at these dates. 1947, 1968, 1988. That's about 20 years apart." She was right. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to follow a pattern, and now it was back. Things got really serious when the Johnsons' boat was found empty one morning. They were good sailors, a couple who'd been coming to the lake for 30 years. Their boat was just floating there, their coffee cups still half full, but no sign of them anywhere. The rescue divers went down to look for them. I wanted to go too, my Navy training would have helped, but Chief Rogers said I was too close to retirement for deep dives. So I watched from the shore as 3 divers went down. Only 2 came back up. The ones who made it back couldn't explain what happened. They said the water got suddenly cold, colder than Lake Tahoe had ever been. They saw lights, got disoriented, and when they could see again, Mike, the 3rd diver, was just gone. That night, sitting in my cabin, I looked at all the evidence spread out on my table, the claw marks, the photos of the lights, the old reports, 20-year cycles, missing people, and now, a missing diver. I knew what I had to do, even though it scared me more than anything. I had to go down there myself. Whatever this thing was, this gleaming, as the old stories called it, I had to find it. Before it took anyone else. Looking at Jimmy's watch again, I made my decision. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's in the dark water. It's knowing you have to go down there anyway. I just didn't know then that what I was about to discover would change everything I thought I knew about Lake Tahoe forever. The next morning, I went to tell Chief Rogers my plan to dive down and check things out myself. But before I could even open my mouth, we got the emergency call. A young girl had been pulled under at the marina. I ran to my truck so fast I forgot my jacket. When I got there, her parents were crying, and people were pointing at a spot near the dock. Her pink float tube was still bobbing in the water. "She was right there," her mom kept saying. "Right there, just a few feet from the dock." Then there was this light in the water, and she just went under. I didn't even think. I jumped in. The water was colder than usual, much colder. As I dove deeper, I saw something that made my heart stop, a trail of that strange blue-green light, moving down into the darker water. I followed it as deep as I could without tanks, but had to come up for air. When I surfaced, Chief Rogers and his team were there with diving gear. This time he didn't tell me I was too old to dive. He knew we needed everyone we could get. We searched for 6 hours. Nothing. Just like the others who had disappeared. That evening I sat in the station looking at old earthquake reports Sarah had found. Something clicked in my brain. Every time people had gone missing in the past, there had been small earthquakes a few weeks before, just like the ones we'd been having lately. I called my old Navy buddy, Rick, who studied underwater caves. He said something that made everything make sense. "Tom, those aren't normal earthquake patterns. They look more like something big moving around down there." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all those people, the Johnsons, Mike the diver, that little girl. Then I remembered something from my Navy days, about how certain deep-sea creatures can make their own light to attract prey. What if this thing, this gleaming, was doing the same thing? The next morning was chaos. 3 more boats had been found empty. The lake water had risen another foot overnight. and people at the beach said they saw massive shapes moving under the water. I went to my old diving locker and pulled out my gear. As I checked my tanks, I heard Jimmy's watch beeping again. Looking at it, I remembered something he'd said the day before his accident. "Dad, sometimes the scariest things are beautiful too." That's when Sarah burst into the station. "Tom, look at this." She had a really old map of the lake, showing underwater caves we didn't even know about. And right there, in the deepest part, someone had written in faded ink, "It sleeps here." I spread all our evidence on the table. The earthquake patterns, the old stories about lights, the 20-year cycle, the rising water levels, the cave map. For the first time, I could see the whole picture. This thing, whatever it was, had been down there for maybe hundreds of years. It would wake up, feed for a while, then go back to sleep in its cave. And now it was awake again. But this time was different. The earthquakes were stronger. The water was rising faster, and it was taking more people than ever before. Something had changed, and we had to stop it. I looked at my diving gear, then at Jimmy's watch. I knew what I had to do next would be dangerous. But as I always told Jimmy, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done anyway. I picked up my radio to call Chief Rogers. We needed to make a plan, and fast, because that thing down there wasn't going back to sleep on its own this time. And I had an idea about how to stop it, but it would mean going deeper into Lake Tahoe than anyone had ever gone before. Chief Rogers thought I was crazy when I told him my plan, but after another boat disappeared that afternoon, he finally agreed we had no choice. "Tom," he said, handing me the special diving equipment I'd asked for, "you sure about this? Those caves are deep, real deep." I nodded, checking my tanks one last time. "If I'm right, the creature has a lair down there, and I think I know how to trap it." From my Navy days, I still had some underwater explosives, the kind we used to clear blocked underwater passages. The plan was simple: find the cave where the creature lived, set the charges, and seal it in. Simple to say, anyway. Doing it would be a whole other thing. Sarah helped me suit up. She pointed to the depth gauge on my wrist, right next to Jimmy's watch. "Remember, Tom, below 200 feet, things get tricky. Your mind can play tricks on you." I knew she was right. Deep water does strange things to your brain. But I'd been there before. What scared me more was what I might find down there. The lake was unusually calm as our boat headed out to the spot above the underwater caves. The sun was setting, turning the water orange and red. It would be dark down there, but maybe that was better. The creature might not expect anyone to come looking for it at night. "Radio check," I said into my underwater comm system. "Clear as a bell," Sarah's voice crackled back. She would be my lifeline, staying on the boat above. Just before I went in, I looked at Jimmy's watch one last time. The screen flickered with a faint blue light, almost like it was trying to tell me something. The water felt like ice as I went down. My powerful diving light cut through the darkness, but somehow the beam seemed to get swallowed up too quickly. At 100 feet, I could still see the surface, a pale gray square above me. At 150 feet, it was gone. That's when I saw the first sign of the caves. A huge dark opening in the rock wall, like a mouth waiting to swallow me. My depth gauge read 180 feet. Inside my head, I could hear Jimmy's voice. "Stay calm, Dad, just like you taught me." I swam closer to the cave entrance. My light showed claw marks on the rocks, fresh ones. I was in the right place. Then I saw it, that blue-green glow, pulsing softly from deep inside the cave. It was beautiful. just like all the witnesses had said. For a moment, I felt myself wanting to swim toward it. But Jimmy's watch beeped softly, breaking the spell. As I went deeper into the cave, my radio crackled. "Tom, you're getting out of range." Sarah's voice was breaking up. "Still here," I answered, but I wasn't sure she heard me. I was on my own now. The cave tunnel went down at a steep angle. My depth gauge showed 220 feet, then 240. The water pressure squeezed at my suit. Every part of my body was screaming at me to go back up. That's when my light caught something that made me freeze. Ahead of me, the cave opened into a huge underwater room, and there, floating in the center, was a mass of that glowing blue-green light. But this time, it wasn't just lights. There was something solid in there, something huge. As I watched, the glowing mass started to move. And that's when I realized I wasn't just watching the creature. It was watching me back. The creature moved towards me, its huge body glowing brighter. Now I could see it clearly. It looked like a giant eel, maybe 30 feet long, with scales that lit up like Christmas lights. But its eyes, they were the scariest part. They looked almost human, and they were fixed right on me. I slowly reached for the explosives in my belt bag, trying not to make any sudden moves. The creature drifted closer. In the glow of its body, I could see things scattered on the cave floor, pieces of boats, diving equipment, and things I didn't want to look at too closely. My radio was dead now. I was alone, deeper than I'd ever been, face to face with something that shouldn't exist. My air gauge showed I had maybe 15 minutes left. Whatever I was going to do, I had to do it fast. That's when I saw it, a narrow tunnel behind the creature, probably leading to another cave room. If I could get it to follow me in there, I could set the charges and trap it. I shined my light right in its eyes. The creature didn't like that. It moved back, making the water swirl around me. I kicked hard, swimming past it toward the tunnel. Just like I hoped, it turned to follow me. The tunnel was tight. I could feel the creature right behind me, its light making crazy shadows on the walls. My heart was beating so fast I could hear it in my ears. 10 minutes of air left. The tunnel opened into another cave, smaller than the first. Perfect. I pulled out the first explosive charge and stuck it to the wall. The creature was right there now, its huge body blocking the way I'd come in. I saw another tunnel on the far side, my way out. Swimming as fast as I could, I placed the second charge near the entrance I'd come through. The creature followed, just like I planned. 8 minutes of air. But then something went wrong. As I tried to swim to the exit tunnel, the creature did something with its body. The water around me started spinning, like a whirlpool. I couldn't move forward. My flippers weren't strong enough. I looked at Jimmy's watch, thinking these might be my last moments. That's when I noticed the watch's digital display was going crazy, just like it did before earthquakes. The creature's lights got brighter, almost blinding. The pressure in the water was crushing me. 6 minutes of air. Not enough time to swim back up anyway. I had one chance. I pulled out my last explosive charge and threw it straight at the creature. At the same time, I hit the detonator for the other charges. The blast was like nothing I'd ever felt before. The cave shook. Rocks started falling. The creature screamed, a sound I never want to hear again. The whirlpool stopped as it tried to dodge the falling rocks. I kicked as hard as I could toward the exit tunnel. Something hit my leg hard. The pain was terrible, but I kept going. 4 minutes of air. I could see light above me now. My leg was sending waves of pain through my whole body. 3 minutes. 2 minutes. The surface seemed a million miles away. My vision was getting dark around the edges when hands grabbed me, pulling me up. Sarah and the rescue team had waited. They got me into the boat just as I took my last breath of air. Later, at the hospital, they told me I'd lost my leg below the knee. But we'd done it. The charges had worked. The cave entrance was completely sealed. Sonar showed no way in or out. The lake went back to normal after that. The earthquake stopped. The water level went down. No more missing boats or strange lights. Whatever that creature was, it was trapped now. Sleeping again, maybe, deep in its underwater prison. I still work at Lake Tahoe, just with a different kind of leg now. Some nights, when I sit on my dock, I think I see a faint blue glow deep down in the water. But then I look at Jimmy's watch, still on my wrist after all these years, and I remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is face your fears, even if they're deeper and darker than you ever imagined. The lake keeps its secrets, and that's probably for the best. But every new ranger gets one special rule from me. If you see lights under the water at night, don't look too long. Just turn around and walk away. Some things are better left in the deep. My name is William Hayes, and this happened to me back in 1995, when I was working as a ranger at Redwood National Park in California. I still have trouble talking about it. Actually, I can't talk about it at all anymore. Not really. But I can write it down, and I think people need to know what's out there in those ancient forests. I was 41 then, and I'd only been a ranger for about 3 years. Before that, I was an anthropologist, studying Native American history and languages. I guess that's why they picked me for this park. There's a lot of sacred Native American sites hidden among these giant trees. I remember exactly how it all started. It was early October, and the morning fog was rolling in thick between the redwoods like white fingers reaching through the forest. These trees, they're something else. Some are over 300 feet tall and older than most countries. Walking among them always made me feel tiny, like an ant walking between skyscrapers. That morning felt different, though. Usually, you'd hear birds singing, squirrels chattering, and all the normal forest sounds, but everything was quiet, too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I was doing my regular morning patrol, checking the hiking trails and making sure no campers had wandered into restricted areas. I had my ranger radio clipped to my belt, my flashlight even though it was morning. You learn quickly that you always need one in these woods, and an old silver amulet I wore around my neck. The amulet was a gift from a tribal elder when I was doing my anthropology work. He told me it was for protection, and though I wasn't usually one for superstition, something made me keep wearing it. As I walked deeper into the forest that morning, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. There, carved into one of the ancient redwoods, was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked fresh, but that was impossible. I'd walked this same trail yesterday, and it hadn't been there. The symbol was like a twisted spiral with what looked like claw marks through it. Something about it made my stomach turn. I reached for my radio to report the vandalism, but all I got was static. That's when I noticed something else. All the animals were gone. No deer tracks, no squirrel droppings, nothing. It was like every living thing had just picked up and left. I didn't know it then, but that quiet morning was the beginning of something terrible, something that would change my life forever and take the lives of others. Looking back, I should have recognized the warning signs. But how could I have known what was really hiding in those ancient woods? And the worst part? This was just the beginning. I tried my radio again, but all I got was that weird static. No big deal. I thought we often had dead spots in the forest. I took some photos of the strange symbol and decided to head back to the ranger station. That's when I heard something that made me freeze. Help. Please. Someone help me. The voice was faint, like a whisper on the wind, but I definitely heard it. It sounded like a young woman, maybe one of the hikers who'd registered at the visitor center yesterday. Hello? I called out, turning slowly around. This is Ranger Hayes. Are you hurt? No answer, just that heavy silence again. I pulled out my flashlight and checked my trail map. The voice seemed to come from the north, near one of the restricted areas, a place the local tribes had marked as sacred ground. We weren't supposed to go there without special permission, but if someone was in trouble, I clicked my radio one more time. Base, this is Hayes. I'm checking out a possible distressed hiker near the North Ridge. Over. Nothing but static. I wrote a quick note in my trail log about where I was heading, just like they taught us in ranger training. As I walked toward where I'd heard the voice, the fog got thicker. The massive redwood trees disappeared into it like giant ghosts. My boots crunched on fallen leaves, and each step seemed louder than it should be. That's when I saw the first footprints. They looked fresh sneaker prints in the soft dirt, but something was odd about them. They started normally, like someone walking, but then they got deeper, like the person had started running, and then they just stopped, right in the middle of the trail. Like whoever made them had just vanished into thin air. I knelt down to take a closer look, and my amulet slipped out from under my shirt. As it dangled there, I noticed something strange. It felt warm to the touch, warmer than it should be. Help, please. The voice again, closer this time. But something was different about it. It sounded wrong somehow, like when you hear a recording of your own voice and it doesn't sound quite right. The hair on my arms stood up. Everything I'd learned in my years studying Native American culture was screaming at me that something wasn't right here. The silence, the symbol, the footprints that vanished. Then I heard it, a sound that couldn't possibly be real. My own voice, coming from somewhere in the fog ahead of me. This is Ranger Hayes. Is anyone there? But I hadn't said a word. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The amulet around my neck was now hot enough that I could feel it through my shirt, and somewhere in the fog, something was moving, something big. I did the only thing that made sense. I started backing away, slowly and quietly. 20 years of studying tribal histories had taught me one thing. When the impossible happens in these ancient places, you don't stick around to ask questions. But as I turned to leave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Every tree around me now had that same twisted spiral symbol carved into it, and they were fresh, dripping with sap. I hadn't heard a single sound of carving, and I hadn't taken my eyes off the trail for more than a few seconds. Whatever was out there in the fog, it wasn't human, and it wanted me to know it was watching. I ran. I'm not ashamed to admit it. 20 years of studying Native American legends taught me that sometimes running is the smartest thing you can do. My boots pounded against the dirt trail as I headed back toward the ranger station, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in front of me. Then my radio crackled to life. "Base to Hayes," came Sarah's voice, my fellow ranger. "Where are you? We've got a situation." I slowed down, catching my breath, and grabbed my radio. "Hayes here. I'm on my way back. What's wrong?" "Two hikers just came in, pretty shaken up. They say they saw." There was a pause. "Well, you should hear it yourself. And Bill's missing." "Bill?" My stomach dropped. Bill Thompson was our most experienced ranger, Been here for 15 years. What do you mean, missing? I asked, still walking quickly. He radioed in 3 hours ago about checking some strange markings on trees in Section C. Haven't heard from him since. Section C. The same area where I'd just been. Where I'd seen those symbols. I was about halfway back when I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. There was a tree I didn't remember being there before. It looked different from the others, newer somehow, but that was impossible. These redwoods were hundreds of years old. As I got closer, my flashlight showed me something that didn't make sense. The bark pattern on this tree. It looked like Bill's jacket, the same Forest Service pattern we all wore. And there, hanging from a branch, was Bill's radio, still softly crackling. "Oh God," I whispered. The amulet around my neck was burning hot now. My radio came to life again. "Will?" It was Bill's voice. "Will, help me. I'm stuck. Something's happening to me." But Bill's radio was right there, hanging from the tree in front of me. The voice came again, but this time it didn't sound quite like Bill anymore. It was deeper, wrong somehow, like someone trying to copy his voice but not getting it quite right. I heard movement in the fog behind me, slow footsteps getting closer, and a sound like tree branches creaking, but not from the wind. "Will." The voice was changing, becoming something else. "Your voice. I want your voice next." I grabbed Bill's radio from the tree and ran. Really ran. Faster than I'd ever run before. The fog seemed to grab at me, trying to slow me down. Behind me, I could hear something following, not running, just walking steadily. Like it knew it would catch up eventually. The amulet bounced against my chest as I ran, hot as a coal but somehow not burning me. And then I remembered something from my research, something about names having power, about creatures that could steal voices, about the old protective magic worked into silver. I needed to get back to my office, back to my books, because if what I thought was happening was really happening, we were all in serious trouble. And somewhere behind me in the fog, that thing was still following, wearing Bill's voice like a borrowed coat, leaving its twisted symbols on every tree it passed. I burst through the ranger station doors, probably looking like I'd seen a ghost. In a way, maybe I had. Sarah jumped up from her desk. "Will, what happened? You look terrible." In the bright fluorescent lights of the station, everything that had just happened seemed impossible. But Bill's radio was still in my hand, solid and real. "Where are those hikers?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. "Break room," Sarah said. "Will, what's going on?" I headed straight for my office first. "Give me 2 minutes. I need to check something." My office was small, crammed with books about local tribal history and legends. I'd been studying these stories for years, but I'd always thought they were just that, stories. Now I wasn't so sure. I grabbed my oldest book, the one written by a tribal elder back in 1920. My hands were shaking as I flipped through it, looking for the chapter about shapeshifters, about things that could steal voices and change their shape. And there it was, the same twisted spiral symbol I'd seen in the forest, drawn in faded ink on the yellowed page. The break room door opened behind me. Ranger Hayes, 2 young hikers stood there, a man and woman in their 20s. Both looked scared. "Tell me what you saw," I said. "Everything." The woman spoke first. "We were on the North Ridge Trail when the fog rolled in. Then we heard voices, our own voices, calling for help. But we hadn't said anything." The man nodded. "We saw something moving in the trees. At first we thought it was another hiker, but..." He stopped, looking embarrassed. "But what?" "It was like the person was changing, like their shape was all wrong. And the trees, the woman shivered. The trees were moving when there wasn't any wind. My amulet was still warm against my chest. I touched it without thinking. The woman's eyes widened. That pendant, is that silver? The old woman we met on the trail yesterday told us to beware of something that hates silver. What old woman? Sarah asked. She was collecting herbs near the sacred grounds. She spoke in the native language first, then in English. She warned us to leave before dark, said something ancient was waking up. I felt cold all over. There aren't any herb collectors with permits right now, and the closest tribal village is 50 miles away. The lights in the station flickered. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Then the radio on my desk crackled. A voice came through, a woman's voice, old and wise. It's waking up, it's hungry. It was the same voice the hikers had just described. But that wasn't the worst part. Through the window, I could see symbols appearing on the trees around the station, carving themselves into the bark with no one there to carve them. We weren't safe anymore, even inside. Sarah grabbed my arm. Will, look! On the window, frost was spreading in a strange pattern. As we watched, it formed words. I know your name, William Hayes. The thing from the forest hadn't just followed me. It had followed me home. Everyone into my office. Now, I shouted, grabbing my book of tribal legends. We didn't have much time. As soon as we were all inside, I locked the door and started pulling down all my research books. The amulet around my neck was practically burning now. Will, what's happening? Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Something old, something from the tribal stories. I flipped through pages frantically. The elders called it the Night Walker. It's a shapeshifter that steals voices and lives. Like what happened to Bill, Sarah whispered. I nodded, not wanting to think about that tree with Bill's jacket pattern. It gets stronger with each person it takes, and now it's awake. The lights flickered again. Through the office window, we could see the fog getting thicker, pressing against the glass like it wanted to get in. There, I found the page I was looking for. The Night Walker fears two things, silver and its true name. The tribes used to wear silver amulets for protection, just like this one. I touched the pendant around my neck. Suddenly, all our radios burst to life at once. Different voices came from each one. Bill's voice, the old woman's voice, my voice, and others I didn't recognize. They were all calling for help, all talking at once. The young female hiker started crying. What do we do? I read faster, scanning the ancient words. The book says there's a way to stop it. The tribes built sacred circles in the forest, places of power. If you can trap the Night Walker in one and speak its true name. A loud cracking sound made us all jump. The window was starting to freeze over, ice spreading in those twisted spiral patterns. Its true name, Sarah said. Do you know it? I turned the page and felt my heart sink. The name was there, but it was written in the old tribal language, a language I knew, but had never tried to pronounce these particular words before. I think so, but we have to get to the sacred circle. It's the only place where the name will have power. The circle up on North Ridge? The male hiker asked. We passed it yesterday. It's just stones in a circle. Those stones have protected this forest for centuries, I said. And they're our only hope. More voices joined the radio static. The ice on the windows was getting thicker, and now we could all hear footsteps in the hallway outside, slow, heavy steps coming toward my office. Will! Bill's voice came from right outside the door, but it wasn't really Bill anymore. Let me in, Will. Let me hear your voice. The doorknob started to turn. frost spreading across the metal. "Back window," I whispered. "There's a maintenance ladder. We need to go, now." As we quietly moved toward the window, I grabbed my flashlight and the book. The amulet was so hot now it felt like it might burn through my shirt. The thing outside was still trying different voices, switching between them like someone trying on clothes. "Please help. Anyone there? Ranger Hayes, come in." I knew we had one chance. We had to make it to the sacred circle before this thing caught us. And then I'd have to speak a name that hadn't been said aloud in over 100 years. If I got it wrong, we'd all end up like Bill. We climbed down the maintenance ladder as quietly as we could. The fog was so thick now I could barely see the ground. My flashlight beam just bounced back at us, like the fog was made of tiny mirrors. "Stay close," I whispered. "The sacred circle is about half a mile up that trail." We started walking, trying to move quickly but quietly. I kept the book open, practicing the strange name in my head. One wrong sound, and it wouldn't work. Behind us, back at the station, all the lights suddenly went out. "Run," I said. "Run now." We took off up the trail, our flashlight beams bouncing wildly. The fog tried to slow us down, thick as soup and cold as ice. Behind us, I could hear it coming, not running, just walking steadily, playing with our voices like toys. "Almost there," the male hiker gasped. "I see the stones." He was right. Through the fog, I could make out the old stone circle. 12 giant rocks, each one taller than a person, arranged in a perfect circle on top of the hill. That's when Sarah screamed. I spun around. In the fog behind us, something was changing. It looked like a person, then like a tree, then like something else, something wrong. It kept shifting, like it couldn't decide what shape to wear. "The circle!" I shouted. "Get inside the circle!" We ran between the stones. As soon as we crossed into the circle, my amulet grew cold. The fog couldn't get past the stones. It was like there was an invisible wall. The thing followed us, walking right into the circle. Now it looked almost human, but not quite. Its shape kept flickering, like a TV with bad reception. "Your voice," it said, using Bill's voice, then Sarah's, then mine. "Give me your voice." I opened the book with shaking hands and started to read the name. The strange words felt like ice in my mouth. The creature screamed, a sound like breaking trees and howling wind all mixed together. It lunged at me, its shape changing faster now, becoming all its victims at once. I spoke the final part of its name. There was a flash of blue light. My amulet shattered like glass. The thing screamed again, but this time the sound went on, getting higher and higher until it hurt to hear it. Then it just fell apart, like a sand castle when the tide comes in. All that was left was a pile of old leaves and twigs, but as it disappeared, I felt something break inside my throat. My voice was gone. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The fog cleared as quickly as it had come. The sun rose over the redwoods, making them look like they were on fire. Sarah touched my arm. "Will, are you okay?" I tried to answer, but I couldn't. I haven't spoken a word since that night. The tribal elders later told me it was the price of using such old magic. The creature took one last voice with it, mine. That was 15 years ago. I still work as a ranger in Redwood National Park, still protect the old places, still wear a silver amulet, though a different one now. And sometimes on foggy mornings I think I hear voices in the forest. But I know better than to answer. Some calls should never be answered, because in those ancient woods, you never know who or what is really doing the calling. My name is Catherine Black, and this happened to me back in 1969, when I was working as a park ranger near Death Valley, Nevada. I still get chills thinking about it, even after all these years. But I need to tell this story. People should know what's hiding in those old mines. I was 35 then, and I knew those mines better than anyone. Before becoming a ranger, I'd spent years as a mining safety inspector. I always carried my old brass miner's lamp with me, a gift from my dad when I first started the job. He said it would bring me luck, and maybe that's why I'm still here to tell this story. It all started with a phone call on a hot Tuesday morning. The sun was already burning outside my ranger station, making the air shimmer like a mirage. The phone rang, and I heard Jimmy, one of our local guides, talking so fast I could barely understand him. "Kathy, we've got missing people in the old Richardson mine," he said, his voice shaking. "Those city folks, you know, the ones who love exploring abandoned places. 3 of them went in yesterday morning and never came out." My stomach dropped. The Richardson mine wasn't just any abandoned mine. It was the deepest and most dangerous one in our area. Its tunnels went down like a giant spider web under the desert, some so old they weren't even on our maps. I grabbed my gear, flashlights, radio, first aid kit, water, and of course, my lucky brass lamp. Something told me I'd need all the luck I could get that day. The drive to the mine took about 40 minutes, my Jeep bouncing over the dusty desert roads. The whole time, I kept thinking about those people trapped underground. When I got there, I saw 3 cars parked near the mine entrance: a red Chevrolet, a blue Ford, and a white Volkswagen. They were covered in desert dust, looking like they'd been sitting there for days, not hours. The mine entrance was a black hole in the rocky hillside, with old wooden support beams that looked ready to fall apart. Before going in, I did what I always do: checked my radiation detector. It's standard procedure near these old mines, especially since they're not far from the nuclear test sites. The needle jumped way more than usual, which was the first sign that something wasn't right. As I switched on my flashlight and stepped into the tunnel, the cool air hit my face. It smelled different than usual, not just the normal musty underground smell, but something else, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My footsteps echoed off the walls, and water dripped somewhere in the darkness. Then I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. About 50 feet in, there was a pile of crushed mining equipment. Not just old rusted equipment, this stuff had been completely flattened, like a giant hand had squeezed it. My flashlight beam showed deep scratch marks in the metal, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I reached for my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. In all my years of cave work, I'd never felt so alone. And that's when I heard it, a sound that wasn't water dripping or rocks settling. It was more like a whisper coming from deeper in the mine. I knew I should wait for help. Everything I'd learned in my training told me to back out and wait for a team. But somewhere in those dark tunnels were 3 people who might still be alive. I took a deep breath, gripped my lucky lamp a little tighter, and stepped deeper into the darkness. I had no idea then that I was walking into the most terrifying experience of my life, one that would change everything I thought I knew about what lives in the deep places of the earth. The deeper I went into the mine, the colder it got. My flashlight beam showed old railroad tracks on the ground, running deeper into the darkness, like a metal path to nowhere. I followed them, keeping my ears open for any sound that might be the missing explorers. That's when I found their first clue, a backpack leaning against the wall. It was a bright orange one, still new-looking, with a water bottle and a half-eaten sandwich inside. The sandwich bread wasn't even stale yet. They had to be close. "Hello?" I called out. "This is Ranger Black. Is anyone there?" My voice bounced back at me from the tunnel walls. But something else came with it. A strange humming sound, like the buzz you hear from power lines, but deeper. I pulled out my radiation detector again. The needle was going crazy now, jumping higher than I'd ever seen it. I rounded a corner and stopped. The tunnel opened into a large cave room where the miners used to sort their gold ore. My flashlight showed old wooden tables, rusty tools, and something that made my blood run cold. The metal support beams, thick steel posts as strong as tree trunks, were bent and twisted like they were made of clay. No cave-in could do that. No natural force I knew of could bend steel that way. I heard footsteps behind me and spun around. My flashlight caught a man in a bright yellow safety vest, Tom Wilson, one of our local rescue team members. He was breathing hard, like he'd been running. "Kathy," he gasped. "Thank God. We've got to get out of here. Something's wrong. Really wrong." "Tom, what happened? Where's the rest of your team?" His face was pale, and his hands were shaking. "We found 2 of the missing people about half a mile in. They were scared out of their minds, talking crazy about something in the dark. Joey and Mike are bringing them up, but Mark went deeper to look for the 3rd person, and..." A rumble cut him off. Not the normal settling of rocks that you always hear in mines. This was different. The ground under our feet vibrated, and dust fell from the ceiling. Then our flashlights started flickering. "That's what happened before," Tom whispered. "When we first saw it." "Saw what?" But before he could answer, both our flashlights went out completely. The darkness wasn't just dark, it felt thick, like black syrup filling the air. Only my old brass lamp gave off a tiny circle of light, barely enough to see Tom's terrified face. Then we saw it. In the darkness beyond our little light, something moved. Not like a person moves, but like a shadow flowing across a wall. Except there was no wall, and this shadow was darker than the darkness around it, and it was coming toward us. Tom's radio crackled to life, making us both jump. Through the static, we heard Mark's voice. "Lower tunnels. It's in the walls. Don't let it." The light. Then nothing but static. I grabbed Tom's arm. "Run. Now." We ran back the way we came, the beam from my brass lamp bouncing wildly off the walls. Behind us, I could hear something moving through the solid rock of the tunnel walls, like a shark swimming through water. The temperature dropped so fast I could see our breath. We reached a fork in the tunnel. I remembered the left path led up to the surface, but Tom pulled me right. "We can't leave," he said between breaths. "Mark's still down there." And the 3rd explorer. He was right. I couldn't leave them down here with whatever that thing was. But as we stood there catching our breath, I noticed something strange. The needle on my radiation detector wasn't just jumping anymore. It was spinning wildly when we faced the thing, but calmed down when we faced away. That's when I started to understand what we were dealing with, and I realized that my old brass lamp might be more than just lucky. It might be the only thing keeping us alive. The question was, how long would its light last? Tom and I crept deeper into the mine, following the sound of dripping water. Every few steps, we'd stop and listen. The only light came from my brass lamp, which made our shadows dance on the walls like giants. "Mark," Tom whispered. "Mark, can you hear us?" A distant crash echoed through the tunnels. Then we heard footsteps, someone running. A beam of light bounced around the corner ahead, and suddenly Mark burst into view. His face was white as paper, and his shirt was torn. "Run!" he screamed. "It's coming!" The air turned ice cold. My brass lamp flickered, and the darkness behind Mark seemed to move. It wasn't just dark anymore. It was like a piece of night had come alive. The thing flowed across the ceiling like spilled ink, spreading out above us. "The side tunnel!" I shouted, pointing to a narrow passage. "Quick!" We dove into the tunnel just as the creature reached for us. I felt something cold brush my shoulder, like being touched by a freezing wind. The radiation detector in my pocket was going crazy, beeping so loud it echoed off the walls. The tunnel was tight. We had to crawl on our hands and knees. Behind us, I could hear the thing trying to follow, but the tunnel was too narrow for it. It screeched in frustration, a sound like metal grinding on metal. "There's a bigger cave room ahead," Mark gasped as we crawled. But that's where I found something bad. The tunnel opened into a large cave, and we all froze. In the dim light of my lamp, we saw what had scared Mark so much. The missing explorer's equipment was scattered everywhere: cameras, ropes, backpacks. But the weird part was how it was arranged. Everything was placed in a perfect circle. In the middle of the circle lay a strange black rock that seemed to eat up the light from my lamp. The radiation detector nearly exploded when I pointed it at the rock. "It's been collecting things," Mark whispered, "like a kid collecting toys. And I think it's learning about us." A cold laugh echoed through the cave. Not a human laugh. All the tunnels leading into the cave began to fill with that living darkness. We were trapped. But I noticed something odd. The creature wouldn't come near my brass lamp, even though it had eaten every other light we had. And when I moved the lamp closer to the black rock, the rock seemed to shrink away. That's when I remembered something from my mining days. This area was full of old uranium deposits. The miners used to avoid certain tunnels because their equipment would go haywire, just like our radiation detectors were doing now. "The uranium," I said. "It doesn't like the uranium." Before I could explain more, the creature made its move. It rose up like a wave of darkness, blocking all the exits. The ceiling began to crack. It was going to bring the whole cave down on us. Tom grabbed my arm. "Kathy, if you've got an idea, now would be a good time." I did have an idea, but it was either going to save our lives or make things much, much worse. I reached for my backpack, remembering the special equipment I'd brought from the ranger station. Inside was something that might just be our only hope if we could survive long enough to use it. My hand shook as I pulled the special radiation testing kit from my backpack. Inside were samples from the old nuclear test sites. They gave them to rangers in case we ever needed to check for contamination. I'd never thought I'd use them like this. "When I say run," I whispered to Tom and Mark, "run for that tunnel behind us. Don't stop, no matter what you hear." The dark creature swirled around us like an angry storm cloud. It was getting braver, creeping closer despite my brass lamp. Small rocks fell from the ceiling as the cave started to shake. My heart was beating so fast I could barely breathe, but I forced myself to stay calm. I opened the testing kit and took out the uranium sample container. The creature suddenly stopped moving, as if it could sense what I was holding. "Now!" I screamed. I threw the container as hard as I could at the black rock in the middle of the circle. At the same time, Tom and Mark ran for the tunnel. The container cracked open when it hit, and then everything went crazy. The creature let out a screech that made my teeth hurt. The black rock started to glow with a sickly green light. The creature tried to run, but it was like it was being pulled toward the rock, like a magnet pulling iron filings. "Kathy, come on," Tom yelled from the tunnel. But I couldn't leave yet. I had to be sure. I grabbed my brass lamp and ran to each tunnel entrance, using it to push the creature back toward the center. The thing fought against it, but the pull of the uranium was too strong. The cave was really falling apart now. Big chunks of rock were crashing down everywhere. I took one last look at the creature. It was being sucked into the black rock, shrinking smaller and smaller. Finally, I ran for the tunnel. Just as I dove in, there was a sound like thunder, and the whole cave collapsed behind me. We crawled through the tunnel as fast as we could, with the ceiling coming down right behind us. We didn't stop until we reached the main shaft. All three of us were covered in dust, coughing and shaking. My brass lamp was dented but still glowing, still bringing us luck. "Look," Mark said, pointing at my radiation detector. The needle was back to normal. We found the other two explorers and the rest of the rescue team waiting at the mine entrance. They'd never seen the creature. It had stayed in the deeper tunnels, hunting us. Later, they sealed up the mine with concrete. They said it was because of cave-ins, but I know better. Sometimes at night, I still check my radiation detector just to be sure, and I always keep my brass lamp close by. The doctors never figured out why I was sick for 3 months after that day. Tests showed weird radiation readings in my blood, but they eventually went away. I've never told the full story until now. Who would believe it? But if you're ever out in Death Valley and you see an old mine entrance, stay away. And if your lights start flickering and the air turns cold, run. Run as fast as you can. Because maybe, just maybe, that thing in the Richardson mine wasn't the only one of its kind. And sometimes, late at night when I'm on patrol, I swear I can hear something moving through the rocks under my feet. That's when I grab my brass lamp and pray that its light never goes out. It's been 5 years since that day in the Richardson mine. I still work as a ranger here in Death Valley, but things are different now. Every time I pass those sealed mine entrances, my brass lamp grows a little heavier in my pocket. Last week, something strange happened. I was doing my usual evening patrol when my radiation detector started beeping. Not as crazy as it did in the mine that day, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I pulled out my lamp, I've never replaced it, dents and all, and shined it toward the old mining hills. For a second, I thought I saw something move in the rocks, a darkness deeper than the night sky. But when I blinked, it was gone. Tom and Mark don't work in these parts anymore. Tom moved to Colorado, saying he'd had enough of desert mines. Mark became a city tour guide. He says the only underground he deals with now is the subway. The 3 explorers we saved that day never came back to Death Valley. Can't blame them. But they did send me a letter last Christmas. Inside was a photo of the Richardson mine entrance from 1969, taken just before they went in. I almost threw it away, but something caught my eye. In the corner of the photo, there's a shadow that doesn't match the sun's position, a shadow that looks like it's reaching out toward the camera. I keep that photo in my desk drawer now, under my radiation detector. Some nights, when I'm alone in my ranger station, I take them both out and check the readings. The detector never shows anything unusual anymore, but I check anyway, just to be sure. Because here's the thing about darkness, the real darkness, the kind that lives and hunts. It's patient. It can wait. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind blows just right across the desert, I hear that metallic screech again, echoing off the distant hills. That's why I still carry my dad's old brass lamp. That's why I still check the radiation levels near every mine shaft. And that's why I'm telling you this story now. Because maybe, somewhere out there in the dark places of the world, something is waiting, something that remembers the taste of light, and maybe, just maybe, it's getting hungry again.